And now continuing with our look today at the Renaissance final review, here are some of the words and concepts that you will see on the test for the Renaissance time period. So, first of all, we had talked about Leonardo da Vinci, one of the Renaissance men of the period. Leonardo da Vinci, one of his most famous works was the Mona Lisa. And this has been an incredible painting over the years. It probably wasn't even that popular at the time, but man, over the years, it has grown by leaps and bounds with its popularity. People flock to the Louvre Museum to take a look at the Mona Lisa. And then we had talked about Florence. Florence was the big city back then, where really the center of the Renaissance started. A lot of the artists, flocked to Florence from the time of the Renaissance time period. It was known as a big banking and trading center. And we'll mention, of course, here, the Medici family were really big in Florence as well. And then, of course, the Renaissance. Renaissance is a French word, and it means rebirth. Okay, it means rebirth. And this was a rebirth of looking back at the classical time period of ancient Greece and Rome, okay, to some of their philosophies and stuff like that. And of course, this was a time period of great innovation in art, in science, in religion, and in philosophy. And then one of the ways that the Renaissance idea spread was because of the printing press. And this helped to spread the Renaissance ideas. And now you were able to get information not just in Latin, but also in the local languages as well. And of course, Italy. Florence is in Italy. And that is where the Renaissance began, in Italy. Italy was the crossroads of the different trade routes throughout the Mediterranean. And that's why Italy is where we saw the beginning of the Renaissance. And then Petrarch, we mentioned humanism. Well, Petrarch was the father of humanism, and it was his ideas about questioning the, accepted teachings of the time. It was Petrarch was the one that began to look at humanism. And then as far as human figures and emotions, we had talked about what was some of the focus of the Renaissance art. Yes, some of it was religion, as you see in this piece here, but pretty much the focus of Renaissance art was on human figures and emotions. And then we mentioned previously in Florence about the Medici family. They were the most prominent Florence, the most prominent family in Florence, the big patrons of the arts as well. And then we mentioned the printing press, but we cannot mention the printing press without the woodblock printing. The woodblock printing had its greatest effect on the Italian Renaissance because of the way the printing was done. And of course, as you can see, this was invented in China first, okay, and then the ideas made their way to Europe, and that is what spurred the making of the printing press. And then what other Renaissance man can we talk about? We mentioned Da Vinci, and now, of course, Michelangelo. And he was responsible for painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That's just one of the great works of Michelangelo. And then, of course, previously, right before this time period of the Renaissance we talked about the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages was the time period before the time of the Renaissance. Renaissance typically is thought about between the 1300s to the 1600s, and just before that was the Middle Ages, from about 450 to about 1300. And whoa, this is a weird name, Antwerp. Isn't that a bad word? You call somebody a twerp? But anyway, Antwerp was the center of the Northern Renaissance. So once the Renaissance left Italy and came to the northern part of Europe, the city of Antwerp was the center for the Northern Renaissance. And we had mentioned previously also about the travels around the world. Well, Ferdinand Magellan was the first person to go completely around the world. Now, he is credited with that. It was his crew, but he didn't make it. Technically, he didn't make it all the way. He was killed in the Philippines, but the rest of his crew actually made it back to Europe. So we'll just give it to Ferdinand Magellan, the first person to circumnavigate. And then humanism, we mentioned Petrarch, humanism. Humanism was the study of the ancient Greek and Roman cultures, okay, with the idea that we're going to focus on human beings and their potential, okay? That is humanism. And then patrons. We mentioned the Medicis were big patrons of the arts. And patrons, these are the people, right, that supported the early work of the Renaissance. Okay, so if you were an artist and you were looking for a patron, this is what you were looking for, someone that could support your work during the time of the Renaissance. And now the Renaissance ideal. What was the Renaissance ideal? Well, the Renaissance was about a change in the way of thinking about the world. And so in this image here, you see the perspective technique here at work. And that was a way of thinking about a new change and thinking about conducting your art. But the Renaissance was also about thinking about the changes in science, in philosophy, in religion. Okay? So changing about thinking about the world. Now, the humanists of the Renaissance, well, their focus was on ideas of the ancient world. Okay, like we mentioned, the classical time period of the Greeks and the Romans. And this was their focus. We had mentioned previously that some of the works of ancient Greece and Rome were translated into Arabic and into Latin with the help of Averroes, in Spain in the 1000s. And he's known as the father of the Renaissance. But the Renaissance time period really took off around the 1300s. And looking back at the ancient world, in particular, Greece and Rome. And then we can't mention the printing press without talking about Gutenberg. He was the one that invented the printing press by using the inventions of China, the wood block printing. And because of the printing press, Bibles then became translated into all different languages. And information was printed so much faster instead of having to rewrite everything by hand. Gutenberg and the printing press. And then Italian republicanism and signorinas were both dominated by powerful, wealthy families. In particular, the Medicis that we had mentioned. They were in control of Florence. And there were other wealthy families that controlled some of the other city-states in Italy as well. Okay? But the domination by particular families in the Italian Republic and the signorinas. And then finally, the School of Athens. The School of Athens was painted by Raphael. And this was, again, kind of a shout out to the ancient Greeks, right? Because you have Plato, Aristotle, Euclid. Right? It's kind of like a fantasy meeting of all of these, famous Greek philosophers and mathematicians. I mean, they all lived at different times. And plus a shout out to Averroes right here. Averroes, the father of the Renaissance. Okay, and so the School of Athens as painted by Raphael. And that's a quick look at the Quizlet vocabulary on the Renaissance final review.